Welcome back, everyone. Today we'll be taking a deep dive into, well, a deep dive actually, specifically the cultural exchange between the Greeks and Romans, a scholarly analysis.
Ah, a fascinating period. A lot of aha moments for history enthusiasts, I'd say.
Exactly. So we'll be looking at the impact of this exchange, on Roman civilization, art, architecture, philosophy, the whole shebang.
Right. And it's interesting, isn't it? The Romans, they conquered Greece, but they also deeply admired Greek culture.
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox. You conquer a place, but you end up being, I don't know, almost obsessed with their culture.
Well, think of it like this. The Romans were like huge fans of Greek intellectualism.
Okay, I see what you mean.
The elite, especially. They hired Greek tutors for their kids. They immersed themselves in Greek philosophy, even tried to copy their speaking style.
So like Cicero, for example, he was a big fan of the Stoics, right?
Exactly. Stoicism was a Greek school of thought, and it really influenced Cicero's, well, his whole worldview.
And this wasn't just some passing fad. This
Mhm.
love of Greek philosophy, it really shaped Roman thought, even their government.
Absolutely. I mean, guys like Plato and Aristotle, their works were basically required reading for anyone who, wanted to be a Roman leader.
Wow. So these Greek philosophers, their ideas about democracy, justice, they actually helped shape Roman law and politics.
Exactly. They provided a framework, you could say, a framework for Roman thought about the ideal state, the legal system, all of that.
It's amazing how these ideas traveled across cultures in time like that.
It is. And speaking of traveling across cultures, the analysis talks about the rule of language.
Right, because Rome had Latin, that was their official language.
Right. But Greek, well, Greek was the cool language.
The cool language.
Yeah, like the language of scholarship, high culture, that sort of thing.
Interesting. So, like, even today, we use all these words that come from Greek philosophy, theater. It's a legacy.
Precisely. It shows how deeply embedded Greek influence is even in our language today.
And that's partly because of all those Roman scholars who translated tons of Greek works into Latin.
Yeah, those translations were like time capsules. They preserved all that knowledge even after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Wow, so those translations helped ensure that Greek ideas survive.
Exactly. They were rediscovered later during the Renaissance, and that sparked a whole new interest in Greek thought.
It's amazing how those ancient texts continued to influence intellectual pursuits centuries later.
Truly. So we see that the exchange wasn't just about, Romans adopting Greek ideas, but also about preserving them for the future.
And this preservation through language, it also played a role in how the Romans approached, like visual art, sculpture,
Oh,
architecture.
absolutely. Roman art and architecture, they owe a huge debt to the Greeks, especially sculpture.
So like those Roman statues we see in museums, they were inspired by Greek masterpieces.
Oh, yeah. During the Republic and the Empire, they were basically copying or at least adapting Greek statues.
So they saw Greek art as the gold standard.
Exactly. They wanted to recreate that excellence in their own work. And it wasn't just statues, it was architecture, too.
Right, because the Romans used columns, porticos, those kinds of things that were very Greek.
Exactly. Think of buildings like the Pantheon in Rome. It's got those Corinthian columns, that massive dome.
It's a blend of Greek inspiration and Roman engineering.
Right. But the Romans weren't just copying, they were also innovating.
Right, the analysis emphasizes that. They drew inspiration, but they also developed their own techniques.
Like the arch and the dome, for example. Those were Roman innovations that allowed them to build bigger and more complex structures.
So like the Colosseum, it's got all those arches and vaults. That's a classic example of Roman innovation, right?
Exactly. They took those basic Greek principles and really expanded on them, made them practical, grand.
And this adaptation, it's a theme we see again and again in this cultural exchange.
Yes. The Romans admired the Greeks, they emulated them, but they weren't afraid to experiment, to make things their own.
And speaking of making things their own, let's talk about Roman mythology. I mean, their gods, Jupiter, Juno, Venus, they're basically Greek gods with Roman names, right?
Exactly. The Romans adopted the personalities, the stories, they just changed the names. Jupiter was Zeus, Juno was Hera, Venus was Aphrodite, and so on.
It's fascinating how they just took these stories and made them their own. Do they recognize the power of these myths?
Oh, absolutely. They weren't just stories to them. They were integral to their worldview, their understanding of the universe, human behavior, all of that.
So these myths served social and religious functions.
Right. They provided moral guidance, they explained natural phenomena, they reinforced social hierarchies. They were a big deal.
It's interesting how the Romans, despite having their own rich cultural heritage, they embraced these Greek myths so readily.
Well, it speaks to the enduring power of those myths. They transcended cultural boundaries. They were compelling stories that resonated with people, even in a different culture.
And this cultural exchange, it also impacted Roman advancements in science and medicine.
Right. Absolutely. The Romans inherited a wealth of knowledge from the Greeks in these fields. Thinkers like Hippocrates, for instance.
Hippocrates, the father of medicine.
Exactly. He laid the groundwork for medical practice. His theories about health, disease, observation, all of that, they were widely adopted by Roman physicians.
So the Greeks gave the Romans a head start in understanding the human body and how it works.
Precisely. And the analysis also highlights Galen, a Greek physician who became very influential in the Roman world.
Galen, he was like a medical superstar, wasn't
He
he?
was. His anatomical studies, his theories, his medical practices, they shaped Western medicine for centuries.
Wow. And all of this based on the work of earlier Greek thinkers like Hippocrates.
Yeah.
It's incredible how influential they were.
It really is. They provided a framework for understanding the natural world, and their ideas had a lasting impact.
But it's important to remember that the Romans weren't just passive recipients of this knowledge. They adapted it, they innovated.
Exactly. They weren't just copying, they were taking those Greek ideas and making them their own.
And that's a key point, isn't it? The Romans weren't just imitators, they were innovators in their own right.
Absolutely. They took what they learned from the Greeks, but they also developed their own unique approaches and ideas. They were a remarkable civilization in their own right.
This adaptation, this innovation, it's a recurring theme in our understanding of Roman culture, isn't it?
It is. It speaks to their ability to learn from others, to adapt to new ideas, and to ultimately forge their own path.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How different would the world be if this whole exchange had never happened?
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. It's a huge turning point in Western civilization, right?
Definitely. You have these two distinct cultures, but they come together and bam, it sets the stage for so much, art, ideas, even legal principles that, well, we still see today.
It's amazing how powerful ideas can be. They can last for centuries, travel across cultures. It's true. And the Romans, they were great at taking ideas from other cultures and making them work for them, making them Roman. It's part of what made them so successful as an empire.
That's a good point, this idea of taking something from another culture and adapting it. It happens all the time in history, doesn't it?
All the time. It makes you think. What are some other examples where this kind of cultural fusion happened? And how did it change things?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It makes you realize that cultures aren't like frozen in time.
Mm.
They're constantly evolving, interacting, influencing each other.
Exactly. The Greeks and Romans, it's just one example, but it's a powerful one. It's still relevant today, with globalization, the internet, everything's so interconnected.
It is. It makes you think about how we define ourselves, our cultural identity, in a world where everything's mixing together.
Right. It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and, well, even navigating the future.
Okay, so we've talked about art, philosophy, even mythology. But what about science and medicine? Did the Romans get a scientific boost from the Greeks?
Oh, absolutely. They inherited a ton of scientific and medical knowledge from the Greeks. It was like a head start, you could say.
Like a foundation to build on.
Exactly. And one of the key figures here is Hippocrates, the father of medicine.
Right, Hippocrates, his ideas about observation, clinical practice, all of that.
Yeah, the Romans, they really embraced those ideas. It shaped how they practiced medicine.
So the Greeks basically provided the Romans with a basic understanding of the human body, how it works, what can go wrong.
Right. And then you have Galen, a Greek physician who was, well, he was huge in the Roman world.
Galen, he was a big deal.
Oh, yeah, a medical rock star. His anatomical studies, his theories, his medical practices, they influenced Western medicine for centuries.
His work must have been pretty groundbreaking for the time.
It was. He was really pushing the boundaries of what people knew about anatomy, physiology, even surgery.
It's mind-blowing to think that those ancient Greek ideas about the body were still influencing medicine hundreds of years later.
It is. And even today, the Hippocratic Oath, that's still a cornerstone of medical ethics.
It shows you how powerful and enduring these ancient ideas can be.
Mm.
They're still relevant, still shaping how we think about health and medicine.
And it wasn't just medicine. Math and astronomy, too. The Greeks were way ahead in those fields, and the Romans, they learned a lot from them. Guys like Euclid and Archimedes.
Right, Euclid with his geometry, Archimedes with all his inventions and discoveries.
Exactly. They laid the groundwork for a lot of Roman advancements in math, physics, engineering.
I mean, the Romans built some incredible things. Aqueducts, roads, bridges. Did they use those Greek mathematical principles in their engineering?
Oh, definitely. They were practical builders, you know. They took those Greek mathematical ideas and put them to work.
So another example of the Romans taking Greek knowledge and applying it to their own needs, to the challenges of building an empire.
Right. They weren't just interested in knowledge for its own sake. They wanted to use it to solve problems, to make things work better.
That's a key difference, isn't it? They weren't just passively absorbing knowledge. They were actively adapting it, making it practical.
Yeah, they were doers. And
Okay.
that's part of what made them so successful. They took what they learned, they made it their own, and they used it to build one of the most influential civilizations in history.
You know, it really challenges the idea that they were just conquerors, just imitators.
It does. They were much more than that. They were innovative, they were adaptable, they were brilliant in their own way.
They were a fascinating blend of, well, brute force and intellectual curiosity.
I think that's a great way to put it. They weren't afraid to conquer, but they were also eager to learn, to adapt, to grow.
It makes their story even more compelling, doesn't it?
Definitely. It's a reminder that history is full of surprises, and that even the most powerful empires can be shaped by the ideas and cultures of those they conquer.
And it's a reminder that cultural exchange, it's a two-way street. It's not just about one culture imposing itself on another. It's about interaction, adaptation, a blending of ideas and influences.
Absolutely. And the Romans, they were masters of that. They took what they liked, they made it their own, and they used it to create something truly remarkable.
So we see this pattern again and again. The Romans admired Greek culture, they learned from it, they were inspired by it, but ultimately they forged their own path.
Exactly. They developed their own laws, their own literature, their own architectural styles. They were unique, even as they drew on the legacy of Greece.
And that brings us to another important point. The Romans weren't just passive recipients of Greek culture. They actively engaged with it, they questioned it, they adapted it to fit their own worldview.
It's a crucial point. This wasn't just a one-way transfer of knowledge. It was a dynamic process of exchange, adaptation, and innovation.
But this process, it wasn't always smooth, was it? I mean, there must have been some tension, some conflict, especially given the power dynamics at play.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you have the Roman conquest of Greece, right? That had a huge impact on how these two cultures interacted.
Right, so even though the Romans admired Greek culture, they were still the conquerors.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that cultural influence can flow in both directions, even in situations where one culture is dominant.
So the Romans might have held the political and military power, but they were still deeply influenced by the cultural achievements of the Greeks.
Right, and that's what makes this exchange so fascinating. It wasn't just about power, it was about ideas, about beauty, about knowledge. It was about those things that transcend political boundaries.
This dynamic really makes you think. It challenges the simplistic idea of a conqueror just forcing their culture on the conquered. It's much more nuanced than that.
It is. It shows how cultures interact in complex ways, how they influence each other, even when there's a power imbalance.
It makes you wonder, though, how the Romans really viewed the Greeks. Did they see them as equals, or did they still feel superior despite their admiration for Greek culture?
That's a tough question. It's hard to say for sure. I mean, they clearly admired Greek intellectual and artistic achievements, but they also believed in their own destiny, their own superiority as a people.
So, bit of a contradiction there.
Maybe, but I think it's more about complexity. The Romans were a complex people with complex ideas about themselves and the world around them.
I can see that. So they might have tried to emulate Greek culture in some ways, but they also wanted to maintain their own Roman identity.
Exactly. It was a balancing act. And it's something we still see today, right? How do we navigate different cultural influences while maintaining our own sense of who we are?
It's a question that's been around for centuries.
Yeah.
And the Roman experience, it offers some interesting insights into those challenges.
Definitely. It shows how a cultural identity is fluid, how it's constantly being shaped and reshaped by the world around us.
And it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people, about ideas, about how cultures interact and shape each other over time.
Absolutely. And the story of the Greeks and Romans, it's a perfect example of that. It's a story that's still relevant today, a story that can teach us a lot about ourselves and the world we live in. Yeah, it's incredible. Two civilizations, so different in many ways, But they found common ground, they exchanged ideas, they learned from each other.
It really shows how complex history is, right? It's not just about conquest, it's about these cultural interactions, these blends of influences.
Exactly. And it shows that even conquerors can be, well, conquered in a way by the cultures they encounter.
That's a great point. So as we've been talking about this Roman adaptation, this innovation, what other examples really stand out to you? Like, how did they take those Greek ideas and make them their own?
Well, one example that comes to mind is Roman theater. They loved Greek theater, the tragedies, the comedies.
Right, the Greeks were famous for their plays.
Exactly. And the Romans, they took those forms, but they added their own twists. Like they developed stock characters, they added more slapstick humor.
So they made it more Roman, more suited to their tastes.
Exactly. Playwrights like Plautus and Terence, they were writing comedies that were funny, but they also reflected Roman society, Roman values.
So it wasn't just entertainment, it was a reflection of their culture.
Right. And another example is philosophy. We talked about how the Romans were more practical, less interested in those abstract philosophical debates.
They were all about applying those ideas to real life, to governing, to ethics.
Exactly. Take Stoicism, for instance. The Romans adopted that Greek philosophy, but they emphasized the parts about duty, virtue, service to the state.
It's like they took the core ideas and molded them to fit their own worldview.
Right. And you see this practical approach in so many areas of Roman culture, from their laws to their engineering.
Yeah, they were amazing builders. They took those Greek mathematical principles, those architectural techniques, and they created some incredible things.
Like the Colosseum, that's a prime example. It combines Greek elements with Roman innovation, Roman engineering.
It's an incredible structure, a symbol of their power and ingenuity.
It really is. And it shows how the Romans could blend different cultural influences, different ideas, and create something truly unique.
And that ability to blend tradition and innovation, to learn from the past while forging their own path, that was a key to their success, wasn't it?
It was. They were open to new ideas, but they also knew how to adapt those ideas to make them their own.
It's a lesson that's still relevant today, isn't it? In a world that's so interconnected, so globalized.
It is. We're constantly encountering new cultures, new ideas. The question is, how do we engage with those differences? How do we learn from them while still maintaining our own identity?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating topic, what are some key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that cultural exchange is complex. It's not just a simple transfer of ideas from one culture to another.
It's more about interaction, adaptation, transformation.
Exactly. And it's a process that has shaped human history, and it continues to shape our world today.
It's also a reminder that cultures are constantly evolving. They're influencing each other. They're enriching each other.
Right. And the story of the Greeks and Romans, it's a perfect example of that. It's a story about the power of ideas, about the beauty of cultural exchange, about the enduring legacy of two of the most influential civilizations in history.
And that legacy, it's still with us today, isn't it? In our language, our art, our architecture, our laws, our philosophy.
It is. It's all around us. And I think it's important to recognize that, to appreciate the richness and complexity of our own culture, and to see the connections between the past and the present.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights on this fascinating topic.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy talking about this period of history. It's full of surprises, and it's incredibly relevant to our world today.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and that you'll continue to explore the wonders of the ancient world.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep discovering the fascinating connections that bind us to the past and to each other.